The letter arrived on a crisp autumn morning in 1878, bearing news that would change Faith Keller's life forever. She stood on the creaking porch of the stage station, the paper trembling in her hands as she read the hastily scrawled words that informed her that William Taylor, her betrothed of 2 years, had died of fever just 3 days before. Faith had traveled over 2,000 miles from Boston to marry a man who now lay beneath the rocky soil of Promise Creek, Wyoming Territory. "Miss, you all right there?" The station master's voice seemed to come from miles away as Faith struggled to breathe through the tightness in her chest. "He's dead," she whispered, her voice catching on the last word. "I've come all this way and he's dead." The station master removed his hat and held it against his chest, his weathered face creasing with sympathy. "I'm mighty sorry to hear that, miss. Do you have somewhere to go? Family waiting." Faith shook her head, her chestnut hair falling loose from its pins. "No, William he was everything. He wrote of the ranch he was building, the life we would have." She folded the letter carefully, tucking it into her reticule with hands that had gone strangely numb. "I suppose I should book passage back to Boston. Stage won't be headed east for another week," the station master informed her gently. "But I can arrange a room at the boarding house until then." Faith nodded absently, her gaze drifting to the dusty main street of the small settlement. Promise Creek hardly seemed like a place that lived up to its name now. What promise remained for her here? As the station master helped gather her trunks, Faith caught sight of a tall figure dismounting from a palomino horse outside the general store. The man moved with the easy grace of someone who'd spent his life in the saddle. His broad shoulders were covered by a worn leather vest, and a dusty Stetson shaded his face. "That's Vaughn Cooper," the station master said, following her gaze. "He was partners with your William. Owns the neighboring spread." Faith felt a flicker of recognition. William had mentioned Vaughn in his letters, a good friend, reliable neighbor, the kind of man you wanted at your side in a territory where survival often depended on the help of others. She watched as Vaughn tied his horse to the hitching post and disappeared into the store. Perhaps he could tell her more about William's final days, give her some closure before she returned east to piece her life back together. The boarding house was a tidy 2-story building with lace curtains that seemed out of place among the roughly constructed buildings that made up the main street. Mrs. Holloway, the proprietress, was a plump woman with kind eyes who clucked sympathetically when the station master explained Faith's situation. "You poor dear," she said, taking Faith's gloved hand between her own. "I knew William, fine man, what a terrible shame." Faith nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in, leaving her feeling hollow and adrift. "Room at the top of the stairs is yours for as long as you need it," Mrs. Holloway continued. "Supper's at 6 sharp, you rest now here." Faith was shown to a small but clean room with a narrow bed and a washstand. Once alone, she sat heavily on the edge of the mattress, finally allowing the tears she'd been holding back to fall. She cried for William, for the life they'd planned together, and for herself, a woman alone in a strange and unforgiving land. She must have dozed off because a knock at her door startled her awake. The light outside her window had shifted, telling her several hours had passed. "Miss Keller, Mrs. Holloway called. There's someone here to see you, a Mr. Cooper." Faith hastily smoothed her rumpled traveling dress and wiped her tear-stained face. "One moment, please," she called, pinning her hair back into some semblance of order. When she opened the door, Vaughn Cooper stood in the hallway beside Mrs. Holloway, hat in hand. He was younger than Faith had expected, perhaps 30, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. A respectful distance from her, he inclined his head. "Miss Keller, I'm Vaughn Cooper. I was a friend of William's. I came as soon as I heard you'd arrived." "Thank you for coming, Mr. Cooper," Faith said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Please, won't you come in?" Mrs. Holloway gave her a sharp look. "The parlor might be more appropriate, dear." Faith flushed. "Of course." A lady did not receive a gentleman caller in her bedroom. Eastern propriety still applied in this frontier town. Of course, she murmured. They settled in the small parlor, Faith perched on the edge of a faded settee while Vaughn sat opposite in a straight-backed chair. He turned his hat in his hands, revealing calloused palms and a silver ring on his right hand. "I wanted to offer my condolences," he began. "William was a good man, one of the best I've known out here." "Thank you," Faith replied, studying the man her fiancé had called friend. "The station master said you were partners?" Vaughn nodded. "We came out here together 4 years back. Each claimed adjoining parcels, helped each other build our places up. He talked about you constantly, was counting the days until your arrival." Fresh grief welled in Faith's chest. "It happened so suddenly. The letter said fever, mountain fever, hit hard and fast." Vaughn's jaw tightened. "I was away driving cattle. By the time I returned, he was gone. I wish I could have done something." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of shared loss hanging between them. "What will you do now?" Vaughn finally asked. "Return to Boston, I suppose. There's nothing for me here." Faith smoothed a wrinkle from her skirt. "The station master says the next eastbound stage leaves in a week." Vaughn hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. "William's ranch, it's yours now." "He made sure of that, had all the papers drawn up proper like as soon as you agreed to marry him." Faith looked up in surprise. "Mine, but I know nothing about ranching. It's good land," Vaughn continued. "The house is nearly finished. William wanted everything perfect for when you arrived." "Mr. Cooper, I appreciate the information, but what use is a ranch to a city-bred woman like myself? I wouldn't know the first thing about managing it." Vaughn set his hat on his knee and met her gaze directly. "You're still wanted here, Miss Keller. William may be gone, but the life he built, the community here, there's a place for you if you want it." Faith felt a flicker of something, not hope exactly, but perhaps the ghost of possibility. "I can't imagine staying. Will you at least come see it before you decide? The ranch. It might help you understand what William was working toward, what he wanted to give you." Faith hesitated, then nodded slowly. What harm could come from seeing the life that might have been hers? Perhaps it would help her find closure. "I'll come tomorrow if that's convenient." Vaughn stood, settling his hat back on his head. "I'll call for you at 10 if that suits." After he left, Faith remained in the parlor, trying to imagine herself as a ranch owner in Wyoming Territory. The very idea was preposterous. She was the daughter of a Boston merchant, educated at finishing school, trained in music and art and proper social graces. What did she know of this wild country? Yet as she stared out the window at the distant mountains, painted gold by the setting sun, she felt a strange reluctance to dismiss the possibility entirely. William had loved this land enough to make it his home. Perhaps she owed it to his memory to at least understand why. True to his word, Vaughn arrived at the boarding house the next morning with a wagon and a spare horse. Faith had dressed practically in her sturdiest traveling dress, and Mrs. Holloway had lent her a bonnet with a wider brim than her city hats to shield her fair skin from the harsh western sun. "Can you ride, Miss Keller?" Vaughn asked as he helped her into the wagon. "I had riding lessons as a girl," Faith replied. "Though I doubt Boston Park riding compares to what's required here." Vaughn's mouth quirked slightly. "The wagon will do fine today, but if you decide to stay, you'll want to reacquaint yourself with the saddle." The road out of Promise Creek quickly gave way to open country, with the mountains rising in the distance. Faith found herself mesmerized by the landscape so different from the crowded streets and manicured gardens of Boston. Here, nature ruled unchallenged, beautiful and terrible in its vastness. "How far is the ranch?" she asked after they'd been traveling for nearly an hour. "Just over the next rise," Vaughn replied, pointing ahead with his chin. William chose the location carefully. Good water, sheltered from the worst winter winds and with a view that'll take your breath away. As they crested the hill, Faith gasped. Below them stretched a green valley, split by a winding creek lined with cottonwoods. Nestled against a gentle slope stood a sturdy log house, larger than Faith had expected, with a broad porch facing the valley. Behind it rose several outbuildings, and in the distance, cattle grazed on the lush grass. William built all that, with help, Vaughn acknowledged. Neighbors pitch in for building, it's the way out here. They descended into the valley, and as they drew closer, Faith could see the details William had included in his letters, the flower boxes waiting for planting beneath the windows, the extra-large hearth he'd described laboring over because he knew how she feared the cold. Vaughn helped her down from the wagon, and Faith stood for a moment, taking it all in. A lump formed in her throat as she realized how much care had gone into creating this home for her. "Would you like to see inside?" Vaughn asked gently. Faith nodded, unable to speak. The interior was simple but well-crafted. The main room held a table William had obviously made himself, chairs with seat cushions awaiting covers, and shelves built into the walls for books and treasures. A cast-iron stove dominated one corner of the room, and beside it, to Faith's astonishment, stood a small piano. "How on earth did he get a piano out here?" she whispered, running her fingers over the keys. "Ordered it special from Denver," Vaughn said, watching her from the doorway. "Had it brought in by freight wagon last month. Said you played beautifully, and he couldn't bear the thought of you going without music." Tears welled in Faith's eyes as she pressed one of the keys, the note ringing pure and true in the quiet house. "There are 2 bedrooms," Vaughn continued, gesturing toward a hallway. "And he dug a root cellar beneath the kitchen. The barn has room for 6 horses, and there's a good chicken coop, 60 head of cattle with his brand, and 15 horses including brood mares." Faith turned to him, overwhelmed. "It's a fortune's worth of work and investment. It's a life," Vaughn corrected gently. "One he wanted to share with you." They stepped back outside, and Faith walked to the edge of the porch, gazing out over the land that now belonged to her. A cool breeze ruffled her hair as she tried to imagine herself here permanently. "How many people work here?" she asked. 2 cowhands, Ellie and Thomas. "Good men. They've been bunking in the small cabin by the barn. And Martha Hawkins comes from town twice a week to help with washing and such." "William thought you might want a woman's company, at least at first." Faith turned to face Vaughn. "Mr. Cooper, I appreciate you showing me all this, but I'm still not convinced I belong here, this life. It requires skills and knowledge I don't possess." Vaughn leaned against the porch railing, studying her face. "May I speak plainly, Miss Keller? Please do. You wouldn't be the first Eastern woman to make a life out here. It's hard, I won't lie about that, but there's something about this land that gets into your blood." He gestured toward the valley. "William believed you had the strength for it, or he wouldn't have asked you to come." Faith considered his words. William had known her, had loved her. He'd seen something in her that perhaps she didn't recognize in herself. Would it be possible for me to stay here a few days? To see what it might be like before making my decision?" Vaughn's eyes warmed with approval. "I think that's a fine idea. I'll have Martha come stay with you for propriety's sake. My ranch is just over that ridge, close enough if you need anything." By the time they returned to town to collect Faith's belongings, she felt a curious mix of trepidation and something like excitement. The grief was still there, a constant ache in her chest, but alongside it grew a seed of determination. She would give herself this time to understand the life William had envisioned for them. Martha Hawkins proved to be a blessing, a no-nonsense widow in her 50s who knew everything about running a frontier household and seemed happy to teach Faith. "Never thought I'd see the day when William Taylor's place had curtains at the windows," Martha commented as she helped Faith hang simple muslin panels they'd found stored in a trunk. "He was saving all the finer touches for when you arrived." "I wish I could have seen his face when he finished building this place," Faith said, smoothing the fabric. "He was proud, that's certain, but mostly he was counting the days until you'd be here." Martha gave Faith an appraising look. "You thinking of staying on then?" "I'm not sure yet. I'm trying to imagine myself here permanently." "Well, if you do stay, you'll need practical skills. Starting tomorrow, we'll see about teaching you what you need to know." The next days passed in a blur of lessons. Martha showed Faith how to work the stove, make soap, preserve food, and a dozen other tasks essential for survival. Illy, a weathered cowhand with a missing front tooth, taught her the basics of horseback riding Western style, which Faith found both terrifying and exhilarating. Thomas, younger and shyer, demonstrated how to milk the cow William had purchased just a month before. Vaughn Cooper rode over each evening, ostensibly to check on the ranch business. But Faith found herself looking forward to their conversations on the porch as the sun set behind the mountains. He never pushed her about her decision, instead telling her stories about the land and its people, answering her endless questions with patience. "What would happen to the ranch if I decided to sell it?" Faith asked on the fourth evening as they watched a hawk circling overhead. "Land's valuable," Vaughn replied honestly. "You'd find a buyer quick enough, might even turn a profit given all the improvements William made. And the hands, Illy and Thomas, they'd find work. Good cowboys always do." Faith nodded, considering. "And you, would you be interested in buying it?" Vaughn was silent for a long moment. "I won't lie and say I haven't thought about it. Our spreads together would make a fine operation." He turned to look at her directly. "But I think it would be a shame for you to leave without giving this place a real chance." Faith sighed. "I've been here less than a week. How can I possibly know if I'm suited to this life?" "Some things take time to know for certain," Vaughn agreed. "But I've watched you these past days, learning from Martha, riding out with Illy. You've got grit, Miss Keller, more than you might think." On the morning of her 7th day at the ranch, Faith woke early and slipped outside before the others stirred. The world was bathed in the pearly light of dawn, dew glistening on the grass as she walked toward the small rise behind the house. William had written about this spot in one of his letters, how he liked to stand here in the morning and plan his day. At the top, Faith paused, gazing out over the land that stretched in all directions. She'd begun to recognize landmarks now: the lightning-struck tree that marked the boundary of their property, the curve of the creek where the best fishing could be found, the distant smudge that was Vaughn's ranch, their property. She caught herself on the thought. Was she beginning to think of this place as hers? A movement caught her eye, a rider approaching from the direction of Vaughn's ranch. Even at this distance, she recognized his straight-backed posture in the saddle. He rode with the ease of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback, guiding his palomino with subtle shifts of his weight. Faith watched him approach, aware of a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the rising sun. Vaughn Cooper had become important to her these past days, his steady presence a comfort, his quiet strength something she'd come to rely on. It was too soon, she told herself firmly. William had been gone barely a month. What kind of woman would she be to feel such things for another man so quickly? And yet, she couldn't deny the way her pulse quickened as Vaughn dismounted at the hitching post and looked up, spotting her on the rise. He raised a hand in greeting, and after a moment's hesitation, Faith waved back. Then, gathering her skirts, she made her way down the slope to meet him. "You're out early," she said as she approached. "Got word from town," Vaughn replied, his expression serious. "Stage is coming through day after tomorrow. Thought you should know in case you're still planning to be on it." Faith felt the weight of the decision she'd been avoiding settle on her shoulders. "I see, thank you for letting me know." They walked together toward the house, neither speaking for a time. "I've been thinking," Faith finally said, "about what would happen to this place if I left. And William loved it here. He poured his heart and soul into building this ranch." She stopped, turning to face Vaughn. "It feels wrong to simply sell it to the highest bidder." Vaughn studied her face, his blue eyes intent. "What are you saying, Miss Keller?" "I'm saying I'd like to try to make a go of it, at least for a while." The words surprised her even as she spoke them, but once said, Faith knew they were true. "I'm not ready to give up on the dream William had for us, for me." A slow smile spread across Vaughn's face, transforming his serious features. "I think William would be mighty pleased to hear that." "I'll need help," Faith warned. "I'm still a city girl in many ways. You've got neighbors willing to lend a hand, me included." As they continued toward the house, where Martha had smoke now rising from the chimney, Faith felt a sense of rightness settle over her. She might fail. The coming winter might prove too harsh, the work too demanding, the loneliness too great, but at least she would have tried. 2 days later, Faith stood on the porch of the general store in Promise Creek, watching the eastbound stage roll out of town without her. Beside her, Vaughn Cooper leaned against a post, a respectful distance away but present all the same. "Having second thoughts?" he asked quietly. Faith shook her head. "No, strange as it seems, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity as Faith threw herself into learning the business of ranching. She studied William's careful ledgers, rode the boundaries of the property with Illy, and spent hours with Martha learning the domestic skills she'd need to survive the coming winter. Vaughn was true to his word, stopping by regularly to offer advice and assistance. He never overstepped, always treating Faith with a respect that acknowledged both her position as a ranch owner and her status as a lady. But she noticed the way his gaze lingered when he thought she wasn't looking, and sometimes caught herself watching him as he worked alongside her hands, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned forearms corded with muscle. It was improper, she knew, to harbor such thoughts about a man while still in mourning for another. Yet as autumn deepened toward winter, Faith found her grief changing shape, becoming less sharp around the edges. William would always occupy a place in her heart, but the acute pain of loss was gradually being replaced by gratitude for the life he'd made possible. The first snow fell in early November, transforming the landscape overnight. Faith woke to a world of white, beautiful but slightly terrifying in its silent power. That afternoon, as she struggled to bring in enough firewood, a rider appeared through the swirling flakes. "Thought you might need some help," Vaughn called, dismounting and leading his horse to the barn. He returned with an armful of split logs, following Faith into the house. "Thank you," she said, grateful for his presence as the wind howled outside. "Martha couldn't make it out from town today. Storm came up faster than expected." Vaughn deposited the wood by the stove and straightened, brushing splinters from his coat. "Where are Ellie and Thomas?" "Checking on the herd in the south pasture. They should be back soon." Vaughn nodded, but Faith saw concern flicker across his face. "This is shaping up to be quite a blow." "Mind if I wait to make sure they get back safe?" "I'd appreciate the company," Faith admitted, moving to put coffee on the stove. As the afternoon wore on and the storm intensified, Faith's worry grew. The hands should have returned by now. Vaughn paced the floor, checking the windows periodically as daylight began to fade. "I should go look for them," he finally said, reaching for his coat. "Vaughn, you can't. The visibility is terrible and it's getting dark." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and they both paused, the moment suspended between them. "I can't sit here while they might be in trouble," he said, more gently. "I know this land better than most. I'll find them." Fear clutched at Faith's heart. The idea of Vaughn riding out into the blizzard, possibly becoming lost himself, was unbearable. "Then I'm coming with you," she declared, reaching for her own coat. "Absolutely not." Vaughn's voice was firm. "One person lost in a storm is bad enough, 2 is just foolishness." "But Faith." He stepped closer, his hands coming to rest lightly on her shoulders. "I need you to stay here. Keep the lamps lit in the windows. If they're trying to find their way back, that light might save their lives." The use of her given name, coupled with the warmth of his hands through the fabric of her dress, left her momentarily speechless. She nodded, reluctantly conceding his point. "Promise me you'll be careful," she whispered. Something shifted in Vaughn's eyes, a softening that made her breath catch. "I promise." After he left, Faith moved through the house, lighting every lamp they owned, placing them in the windows as beacons against the gathering darkness. Then she stoked the fire in the stove and put on a pot of stew. The men would need hot food when they returned. "If they returned," whispered a treacherous voice in her mind. Faith pushed the thought away, focusing instead on practical tasks. She warmed blankets by the fire, prepared hot bricks wrapped in flannel to put in beds, and kept coffee brewing. All the while, she strained to hear sounds of approaching riders over the howl of the wind. Hours passed with excruciating slowness. Faith found herself praying more fervently than she had since receiving the news of William's death, pleading with God to bring them all back safely. The thought of losing Vaughn, of never seeing his steady blue gaze or hearing his deep voice again, was almost more than she could bear. It was well past midnight when she heard the sounds, the whinny of horses, men's voices calling to each other. Faith flew to the door, flinging it open to see 3 snow-covered figures emerging from the darkness, leading tired horses. "Thank God," she breathed, rushing out to meet them. Ilian Thomas looked exhausted but unharmed. Vaughn's face was reddened from the cold, ice crusting his beard, but his eyes warmed at the sight of her. "Found them holed up in the line shack," he explained as they led the horses to the barn. "Smart enough to seek shelter when the storm hit." Once the animals were tended to, all 4 made their way to the house where Faith served hot stew and coffee. The men ate ravenously, their cold, stiffened fingers gradually regaining feeling in the warmth of the kitchen. "You two take the second bedroom," Faith instructed Ilian Thomas when they'd finished eating. "It's too dangerous to try making it to your cabin tonight." The hands thanked her gratefully before stumbling off to sleep. Faith turned to Vaughn, who stood by the stove, exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. "You should stay too," she said quietly. "The storm hasn't let up." "Wouldn't be proper," Vaughn replied, though she could see he was dead on his feet. "Your reputation, hang propriety," Faith interrupted, surprising herself with her vehemence. "I almost lost you tonight. I won't send you back out into that blizzard for the sake of appearances." Vaughn looked startled, then a slow smile curved his lips. "Almost lost me, huh?" Faith felt heat rise to her cheeks. "You know what I mean, all of you. I was worried sick about all of you. MMHMM. His smile widened slightly before he sobered. "Where would I sleep? House only has 2 bedrooms. You can take my room. I'll make up a pallet here by the stove." "Not a chance. If anyone's sleeping on the floor, it's me." In the end, they compromised. Faith made up a bed for Vaughn on the floor of the main room, close enough to the stove to benefit from its heat, but far enough from her bedroom door to maintain some semblance of propriety. Before retiring, Faith paused in the doorway, watching as Vaughn settled onto the makeshift bed. "Thank you," she said softly, "for finding them, for coming back safely." Vaughn looked up at her, his face shadowed in the dim light of the banked fire. "I made a promise, didn't I?" Faith nodded, suddenly unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She slipped into her bedroom and closed the door, leaning against it as she tried to steady her racing heart. What was happening to her? This feeling, this overwhelming concern for Vaughn Cooper's well-being, went far beyond neighborly regard. She was falling in love with him. The realization should have shocked her, but instead, it settled over Faith with the rightness of a puzzle piece clicking into place. Perhaps it had been building since that first day when he'd told her she was still wanted here. Or perhaps it had grown gradually through the weeks of his patient guidance and steady presence. Faith moved to the window, watching the snow continue to fall in the darkness. What would William think, knowing his fiancé had developed feelings for his friend and partner? The question brought a fresh wave of guilt, until Faith remembered something Martha had told her weeks ago. William wasn't one to dwell on what couldn't be changed, the older woman had said. He'd want you to find happiness, wherever that might lead you. Faith pressed her forehead against the cold glass, her breath fogging the pain. Could she find happiness with Vaughn? Would he even want her, knowing she came with the complications of a ranch to run and the shadow of his friend's memory? Sleep was long in coming that night, and when Faith finally drifted off, she dreamed of blue eyes watching her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. Morning brought clarity with its brilliant sunshine. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine world of white that sparkled blindingly in the light. Faith rose early, dressing quietly before stepping into the main room. Vaughn was already up, stoking the fire in the stove. "Good morning," she said, suddenly shy in his presence. He turned, and the smile he gave her sent warmth spreading through her chest. "Morning, storm's blown itself out, so I see." Faith moved to the window, looking out at the transformed landscape. "It's beautiful. Treacherous, though. Drifts will make travel difficult for a few days." Faith turned back to face him. "Does that mean you'll be staying here a while longer?" Something flickered in Vaughn's eyes, hope, perhaps, or uncertainty. "Would that be all right with you?" "Yes," Faith said simply. "I'd like that very much." The next days established a new pattern. With travel difficult, Vaughn remained at the ranch, sleeping in the small cabin with Ellie and Thomas once the path had been cleared enough to reach it. During the days, all four of them worked together to ensure the cattle had access to feed and water. Breaking through ice on the creek and distributing hay from the stacks William had prudently put up before his death. Faith worked alongside them as much as she could, learning the rhythms of ranch life in winter. In the evenings, they gathered in the main house where Faith cooked simple but hearty meals. Sometimes Martha would join them if she'd managed to make it out from town, bringing gossip and advice in equal measure. Christmas approached, bringing with it a festive spirit that Faith hadn't expected to feel so far from the elaborate celebrations of her Boston childhood. She found herself wanting to make the holiday special, not just for herself, but for the men who had become something like family to her. One afternoon, while Vaughn and the hands were checking fence lines damaged in the storm, Faith rode into town with a list of items she hoped to find at the general store. Promise Creek had changed since her arrival months before she now knew most of the townspeople by name, exchanging greetings as she made her way down the snow-packed street. Inside the store, Mr. Jenkins, the proprietor, welcomed her warmly. "Mrs. Taylor, good to see you out and about." Faith had given up correcting people who assumed she was William's widow. It was simpler than explaining the truth, and in some ways it felt like honoring his memory. "Hello, Mr. Jenkins. I'm hoping you might have a few special items for Christmas." The storekeeper helped her find most of what she sought: sugar and spices for baking, small gifts for Ellie and Thomas, and a bolt of red flannel she planned to fashion into curtains for the cabin the hands shared. But as she prepared to leave, Faith realized she hadn't found anything for Vaughn. What could she possibly give the man who had become so important to her? Something useful, certainly, but also something that conveyed her deepening feelings without being inappropriately forward. "Is there something else you're looking for, Mrs. Taylor?" Mr. Jenkins asked, noticing her hesitation. "I need a gift for a friend, a gentleman who's been very helpful since William's passing." Mr. Jenkins' eyes twinkled knowingly. Would this gentleman happen to be Vaughn Cooper by chance? Faith felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Was I that obvious? Word gets around in a small town," he said kindly. "And it's no secret that Vaughn's been spending considerable time at your ranch. Folks think it's a good thing, you having someone to rely on." "It's nothing improper," Faith felt compelled to clarify. "He's been a tremendous help with the ranch, nothing more, of course." Mr. Jenkins didn't look convinced. "Well, as for a gift, Vaughn's a practical man, not one for frivolous things." Faith nodded, considering. "Do you have any books?" He mentioned enjoying reading during the long winter evenings. Mr. Jenkins led her to a small shelf at the back of the store where a selection of books was displayed. Faith ran her fingers over the spines, searching for something that might appeal to Vaughn. Her eyes fell on a volume of poetry by Walt Whitman, Leaves of Grass. She recalled Vaughn quoting poetry once, when they'd watched a particularly spectacular sunset together. "This one," she decided, taking the book, "and I'd like it wrapped, please." When she returned to the ranch, Faith hid her purchases carefully before beginning preparations for a Christmas Eve dinner. She baked pies and bread, roasted a chicken, and decorated the main room with pine boughs Ellie had brought in from the forest. On Christmas Eve, as twilight fell, Faith lit candles around the room and put the finishing touches on the table. She changed into her best dress, a dark green wool that brought out the amber flecks in her eyes, and pinned her hair up in a style more elaborate than her usual practical arrangement. When Vaughn knocked at the door, Faith felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. She smoothed her skirts before opening the door, only to find herself momentarily speechless. Vaughn had clearly made an effort as well. His usually dusty clothes had been brushed clean, his hair still damp from washing, and he'd trimmed his beard. In his arms he carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Merry Christmas, Faith," he said, his voice warm. "Merry Christmas," she replied, stepping back to let him in. "You look very nice." A slight flush colored his cheekbones. "As do you." His gaze traveled around the room, taking in the decorations and candlelight. "You've been busy." Ali and Thomas arrived moments later, both looking slightly uncomfortable in their Sunday best but pleased by the festive atmosphere. The meal was a merry one, with stories and laughter flowing as freely as the coffee Faith served afterward, when the hands excused themselves to return to their cabin. Laden with plates of leftover pie, Faith found herself alone with Vaughn. A comfortable silence settled between them as they sat before the fire, the room glowing golden in the light of the flames. "I have something for you," Vaughn said finally, reaching for the package he'd set aside earlier. Faith accepted it with a smile. "And I have something for you." She retrieved his gift from where she'd hidden it beneath the settee. "Ladies first," Vaughn insisted. Faith carefully unwrapped the brown paper to reveal a small wooden box, beautifully carved with a pattern of wildflowers. "It's lovely," she breathed, running her fingers over the intricate design. "Open it," Vaughn urged, watching her face. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft cloth, lay a silver brooch in the shape of a flower. The workmanship was exquisite, the petals delicately rendered and set with a small pearl at the center. "Vaughn, it's beautiful." Faith lifted the brooch, admiring how it caught the firelight. "Where did you find such a thing out here?" Had it ordered from Denver months ago. "It reminded me of the wildflowers that grow in the valley come spring." He paused. "Thought you might like having something pretty, living out here where practical things are usually all we have time for." The thoughtfulness of the gift brought tears to Faith's eyes. "I love it, truly." Vaughn's smile was soft with relief. "Good, that's good." Faith handed him his gift, suddenly worried it wouldn't measure up to the beautiful brooch. "Your turn now." Vaughn unwrapped the book carefully, his expression growing surprised and pleased as he recognized the title. "Whitman," he said, opening the volume and leafing through the pages. "How did you know?" "You quoted him once when we were watching the sunset. I remembered how much you seemed to love the words." Vaughn looked up at her, something indefinable in his gaze. "Thank you, Faith. This means a great deal to me." They sat in silence for a moment, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. "Faith," Vaughn began finally, setting the book aside, "there's something I need to say to you." Her heart began to race. "Yes, I know it might be too soon." "William was my friend, and I respected him greatly." Vaughn leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "But these past months, watching you build a life here, seeing your strength and determination, I've developed feelings that go beyond friendship." Faith's breath caught in her throat. "Vaughn." "You don't have to say anything now," he continued quickly. "I understand if you need time or if you don't feel the same way. I needed you to know." Faith rose from her seat and moved to sit beside him on the settee, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "I've been struggling with the same thoughts," she admitted quietly. "Wondering if it's wrong to feel this way when William has been gone such a short time." "And what have you decided?" Vaughn asked, his voice rough with emotion. "That life is too precious and too uncertain to deny what's in our hearts." Faith reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. "I care for you, Vaughn, very much." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after a long night. "May I call on you properly then?" "Court you as you deserve to be courted," Faith laughed softly. "We live 30 miles from the nearest theater or restaurant. I'm not sure what proper courting looks like out here." "I'll figure something out," Vaughn promised. his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a way that sent shivers up her arm. As the fire crackled and snow began to fall again outside the windows, Faith felt a sense of peace settle over her. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. Running a ranch never was, especially for a woman, but she wouldn't be walking it alone. Spring arrived with an explosion of green, transforming the valley into the paradise William had described in his letters. Faith stood on the porch one morning in late April, watching as new calves frolicked in the pasture while their mothers grazed nearby. The ranch had survived its first winter under her management, thanks in no small part to Vaughn's guidance and the loyal work of Ilian Thomas. And true to his word, Vaughn had been courting her with a determination that both amused and touched Faith deeply. He'd arranged picnics by the creek, brought her wildflower bouquets, and once even convinced a traveling musician passing through Promise Creek to detour to the ranch and play for them. Today, he'd promised to take her to a special place he knew in the mountains, now that the trails were clear enough for riding. Faith had packed a lunch and dressed in the split riding skirt Martha had helped her, so far more practical than the side-saddle riding habits she'd worn in Boston. When Vaughn rode up, leading a second horse for her, Faith felt the now familiar flutter in her chest at the sight of him. 6 months of proper meals at her table had filled out his lean frame, and the spring sun had already darkened his tan. But it was the way his eyes lit up when he saw her that made her heart skip a beat. "Ready for an adventure, Miss Keller?" he called, using her formal name with the teasing tone that had become their private joke. "Lead on, Mr. Cooper," she replied, accepting his help to mount her horse. They rode for nearly 2 hours, climbing steadily into the foothills of the mountains. Vaughn pointed out landmarks and wildlife along the way: a hawk's nest high in a pine tree, tracks where a mountain lion had passed the night before, a distant herd of elk grazing in a high meadow. Finally, they crested a ridge and Vaughn reined in his horse. "We're here," he said simply. Faith gasped at the vista spread before them. A crystal-clear lake nestled in a natural bowl of the mountains, its surface reflecting the snow-capped peaks that surrounded it. Wildflowers carpeted the shoreline in a riot of colors: purple lupine, orange paintbrush, yellow sunflowers. "It's the most beautiful place I've ever seen," Faith breathed as Vaughn helped her dismount. "William and I discovered it our first summer here," Vaughn explained, leading her to a flat rock overlooking the water. "We used to fish here sometimes. He always said he wanted to bring you here once you arrived." Faith felt a pang of sadness, quickly replaced by gratitude. "Thank you for sharing it with me." They spread their picnic on the rock, eating in companionable silence as they watched an eagle soar over the lake. When they'd finished, Vaughn reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Faith," he began, his voice suddenly serious. "These past months have been the happiest of my life." Faith felt her pulse quicken. "Mine too," she admitted softly. "When you first arrived in Promise Creek, you were mourning William, and I was just the neighbor offering help." Vaughn took her hand in his. "But something grew between us that I never expected, something I've come to treasure above all else." He opened the pouch and tipped a simple gold ring into his palm. It wasn't elaborate or fancy like the engagement ring William had sent her in Boston, but to Faith it was perfect in its honest simplicity. "I love you, Faith Keller. I love your strength, your determination, your kind heart." Vaughn's voice roughened with emotion. "I know it might seem fast, and if you need more time, I understand. But I can't imagine my life without you in it." Tears welled in Faith's eyes as Vaughn slid from the rock to one knee before her. "Faith, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" For a heartbeat, Faith felt William's presence not as an impediment but as a blessing. She could almost hear his voice saying, "Be happy, Faith, that's all I ever wanted for you." "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Vaughn, I would be honored to be your wife." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her hand. Vaughn rose and drew her to her feet, his arms encircling her waist. "May I kiss you, Faith? I've been wanting to for so long." "Please," she murmured, her hands coming to rest on his chest. Vaughn's lips met hers with exquisite tenderness, a kiss that spoke of reverence and promise. Faith leaned into him, her heart overflowing with a joy so pure it brought fresh tears to her eyes. When they finally parted, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. "We'll build something beautiful together," he promised. "A life, a family, a legacy." "We already have," Faith replied, thinking of the ranch waiting for them in the valley below, the home that had become truly hers, and now would be theirs together. They were married on a perfect day in June, with wildflowers decorating the small church in Promise Creek. Martha had helped Faith sew a simple but elegant wedding dress, and Ellie stood as Vaughn's best man. The entire community turned out to celebrate, filling the church to overflowing. As Faith spoke her vows, she felt at peace with the journey that had brought her here, the grief that had given way to new beginnings, the strength she'd discovered within herself, and the love that had grown in the most unexpected circumstances. That night, as Vaughn carried her over the threshold of what was now their home, Faith knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. "Welcome home, Mrs. Cooper," Vaughn murmured against her hair. Faith smiled up at the man who had taught her that life could offer second chances and that love, like the western landscape, could be both unexpectedly beautiful and enduringly strong. "I am home," she replied simply. "With you." 5 years later, Faith stood on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching as Vaughn taught their 4-year-old son William to ride his pony in the corral. Nearby, their 2-year-old daughter Rebecca toddled after a butterfly, her chubby legs carrying her through the spring grass with determined purpose. The ranch had prospered beyond their expectations. They doubled their herd, added new buildings, and even planted an orchard that was finally beginning to bear fruit. Faith ran her hand over her slightly rounded belly, where their third child was just beginning to show. Life in Wyoming Territory wasn't always easy. They'd weathered blizzards and drought, dealt with rustlers and illness. But they'd faced every challenge together, their bond growing stronger with each passing season. As Vaughn lifted little William from the pony and set him on his shoulders, both of them laughing with delight, Faith's heart swelled with gratitude. What had begun with grief and uncertainty had blossomed into a life filled with love, purpose, and belonging. She had come west as a mail-order bride, seeking a future with a man she'd never met. She'd found heartbreak instead, but also a second chance she could never have imagined. Vaughn had been right that first day when he'd told her she was still wanted here. Faith stepped off the porch to join her family, smiling as Vaughn's eyes found hers across the yard. The promise of their life together stretched before them like the vast Wyoming sky, boundless, beautiful, and filled with endless possibilities.